The chandeliers of Hargrove House held 400 candles each, and every single flame seemed to lean toward Duchess Cressida Blackwell as she stood at the edge of the grand ballroom. The Spring Assembly of 1843 had drawn every titled family in Mayfair to this pillared mansion on the corner of Berkeley Square, and the air was thick with French perfume, warm champagne, and the sort of gossip that could ruin a family name before the orchestra finished its first waltz. Cressida had dressed carefully for the evening. Her gown was a deep emerald silk, fitted close at the waist and falling in layered folds that brushed the polished marble floor. Around her throat sat a strand of freshwater pearls that had belonged to her mother, and on the third finger of her right hand she wore the Blackwell family crest ring, a gold band engraved with the oak tree and falcon of the Oakhaven Duchy. She had carried that ring for 6 years, ever since the morning after her wedding, when Peregrine himself had slid it onto her finger and told her she was now the face of his ancient house. 6 years. She had believed every word. The trouble started 20 minutes after the doors opened. Cressida was standing near the tall windows that overlooked the garden, speaking with the elderly Countess of Pemberton about the charitable lending library they were funding together in Cheapside. It was an easy, warm conversation, the kind Cressida enjoyed most. She preferred substance over spectacle. She always had. Then the front doors of the ballroom swung open with the sort of dramatic timing that only a man deeply in love with his own entrance could arrange. Duke Peregrine Blackwell strode into Hargrove House with his chin raised and his chest out, wearing a freshly tailored black evening coat with silver buttons that caught the candlelight. His dark hair was swept back with oil, and his boots had been polished to a shine that could blind a footman. He looked, as he always did, like a man who believed the entire world had been built specifically for him to walk through. But he was not alone. On his arm walked a woman Cressida had never seen before. She was tall and slender, with auburn hair pinned beneath a jeweled comb, and she wore a gown of pale lavender that whispered against the floor as she moved. She smiled at the room the way a queen might smile at her court, graciously, patiently, as though she had been expected all along. The murmur that rippled through the ballroom was instant. 300 guests turned their heads at the same moment, and 300 pairs of eyes flickered between the unknown woman on the Duke's arm and the Duchess standing alone by the window. Cressida felt the shift in the room the way a sailor feels the wind change direction. She did not move. She did not blink. She simply watched. Peregrine walked the woman straight down the center of the ballroom, past the dancing couples, past the refreshment tables, past the clusters of lords and ladies who parted for him like water around the bow of a ship. He guided her to the head table, the long, raised table draped in white linen and decorated with hothouse roses, and pulled out the chair at its center. The chair meant for Cressida. The woman sat down with a practiced elegance, arranging her skirts and placing her gloved hands flat on the tablecloth. Peregrine stood beside her, one hand resting on the back of the chair, and addressed the nearest footman in a voice loud enough for half the room to hear. "A glass of the Sauterne for Lady Amice, and see to it the kitchen sends out the first course. We are famished." Lady Amice. The name traveled across the ballroom in seconds, carried from mouth to ear like fire across dry grass. Nobody knew who she was. Nobody had seen her at any gathering before. And yet here she sat, in the Duchess's chair, at the Duchess's table, with the Duke's hand hovering near her shoulder as though she belonged there. The Countess of Pemberton touched Cressida's elbow gently. "My dear," she whispered, her old eyes full of concern and something close to fury. "Shall I call for your carriage?" Cressida looked at the Countess. She looked at Peregrine, who had not glanced in her direction even once since entering the room. She looked at Lady Amice, who was now laughing softly at something the man beside her had said. And then Cressida did something that nobody in that ballroom expected. She did absolutely nothing dramatic. There was no shriek, no tears, no storming across the dance floor to confront her husband, no trembling hand pointed at the stranger in her seat. Every person in that room had been holding their breath, waiting for the scene, hungry for the explosion that would give them a month's worth of drawing-room gossip. Cressida denied them all. She turned calmly, walked to the head table, and set down the champagne glass that a passing footman had placed in her hand earlier. She had not taken a single sip from it. Then, with the steady fingers of a woman who had already made her decision long before this evening began, she slipped the Blackwell crest ring from her finger and placed it gently on the white linen tablecloth, right beside the untouched glass. The gold caught the candlelight for a moment, and the engraved falcon seemed to stare upward at the chandeliers as though it, too, was tired of this house. Cressida turned and walked toward the ballroom doors. Her back was straight, her stride was even, her emerald gown trailed behind her, like a quiet farewell. Peregrine finally noticed. He frowned, watching her go, and gave a short, dismissive laugh that he shared with the gentleman standing to his left. "She'll be back by morning," he muttered. "She always sulks for a night and then returns. Fetch me another bottle." He was wrong about many things that evening, but he was most wrong about that. Outside Hargrove House, the cool April air hit Cressida's face, and she breathed it in deeply. A private carriage was already waiting at the far end of the street, its lamps unlit, its horses dark and fast. Her lady's maid, Ruth, was sitting inside with a leather travel case and a thick wool cloak. "Is everything prepared?" Cressida asked as she climbed in. Ruth nodded. "The documents are in the case. The Berkshire Road is clear. We will arrive before dawn if the horses hold." Cressida pulled the cloak around her shoulders and looked once, briefly, at the glowing windows of Hargrove House. She could hear the faint sound of the orchestra starting up again, the laughter drifting out into the night, the clinking of crystal glasses raised in toasts to people who would never toast to her. She tapped the roof of the carriage twice. The driver cracked the reins, and the horses surged forward into the dark London streets. By the time the last waltz played inside Hargrove House, the Duchess of Oakhaven had already crossed the western edge of the city, heading toward Berkshire at full speed, carrying with her a set of documents that would bring the mighty Duke Peregrine Blackwell to his knees. She had left behind the ring, the title, and the humiliation. She was taking everything else. The road from London to Berkshire was a rough companion in the dark. The carriage rattled over packed earth and loose stone, and the hedgerows on either side rose like black walls against a moonless sky. Ruth had fallen asleep within the first hour, her head resting against the leather cushion, her small frame rocking gently with every bump and turn. Cressida did not sleep. She sat with the travel case on her lap, her fingers resting on its brass clasp, and watched the shadows of the English countryside slide past the window. She had planned this journey for 5 months. 5 months of quiet preparation, of letters written in private rooms and meetings held behind closed doors, while Peregrine was away at his clubs and card tables. 5 months of gathering papers, confirming dates, and tracing the tangled financial roots of the Blackwell family fortune back to their true source. It had taken patience she did not know she possessed, and a kind of cold, careful thinking that her finishing school tutors would never have taught her. But her father had taught her. Henry Valmont, the founder of the Valmont Banking Merchant Guild, had raised his only daughter the way most men raised their sons. He had sat her down at his mahogany desk when she was 12 years old and shown her how to read a ledger. By 15, she could calculate compound interest faster than his senior clerk. By 18, she understood the difference between a secured bond and an unsecured note. And she knew, with the certainty of someone who had grown up surrounded by numbers, that money was never simply money. It was power, it was protection, and most dangerously of all, it was memory. Money remembered everything, every debt, every promise, every handshake sealed over port and cigars in a gentleman's study. Money kept its records long after the men who made the deals had forgotten them. Peregrine had forgotten. His father, the late Duke, had certainly hoped everyone would forget. And for 6 years, that hope had held. The carriage pulled through the iron gates of the Valmont Guild's Berkshire office just as the first grey light of dawn began to press against the horizon. The building was a solid, unlovely structure of red brick and slate, set back from the main road behind a high wall topped with iron spikes. It looked more like a fortress than a place of business, which was precisely the point. Inside those walls sat the most secure private archive in the south of England. 3 underground vaults lined with lead and guarded day and night by men who answered only to the Valmont family. Cressida stepped down from the carriage, stiff and cold from the journey, and was met at the front door by a grey-haired man in a plain brown coat. This was Mr. Edmund Hale, her father's oldest and most trusted solicitor, who had served the Valmont family for over 30 years. He bowed slightly, his expression grave and steady. "Your Grace, we have been expecting you." "You may stop calling me that, Mr. Hale. I suspect the title will mean very little by the end of the month." Hale allowed himself the faintest trace of a smile. "As you wish, madam. The vault is open. Everything is as you left it." He led her through the ground floor offices, past rows of clerks' desks that sat empty at this early hour, and down a narrow stone staircase that descended beneath the building. The air grew cooler with each step, and the walls changed from plaster to bare stone. At the bottom of the stairs stood a heavy oak door reinforced with iron bands, and behind it a second door of solid steel fitted with 3 separate locks. Hale produced a ring of keys from his coat pocket and opened each lock in sequence. The final door swung inward with a slow, heavy groan, and the lamplight from the corridor spilled into the vault beyond. The room was lined from floor to ceiling with wooden shelves, and on those shelves sat hundreds of leather folders, tin boxes, and sealed envelopes arranged in strict alphabetical order. Each one was labeled in the precise, angular handwriting of Henry Valmont himself. This was the private archive of every financial arrangement the Valmont Guild had brokered over the past 40 years, and at its center, on a reading table cleared of everything except a single brass lamp, sat a thick folder bound with red cord. Cressida untied the cord and opened the folder. Inside were 6 original loan charters, each one written on heavy parchment and stamped with the wax seal of both the Valmont Guild and the Blackwell Duchy. The dates ranged from 1837 to 1842, and the amounts were staggering. The late Duke, Peregrine's father, had borrowed enormous sums from the Valmont Guild during the final years of his life. The Oakhaven estate had been bleeding money for decades, drained by poor harvests, crumbling tenant farms, and the old Duke's fondness for racehorses that never won. By the time he died in 1839, the Blackwell family owed the Valmont Guild more than the entire estate was worth. And here was the detail that changed everything. The loans had not come from the Guild's general fund. They had come from Cressida's personal line of inheritance, a private trust established by her father before his death, managed solely in her name, and legally untouchable by any husband under the terms of the original settlement deed. When Peregrine married Cressida in 1837, he had signed those terms without reading them. He had glanced at the settlement, waved his hand, and told his solicitor to handle the details. He had been far more interested in the wedding breakfast. That single act of carelessness had left Cressida holding the deed to every loan that kept his family's name above water. She spread the charters across the reading table and checked each signature, each date, each witness mark. Everything was in order. Everything was exactly where her father had placed it years ago, as though the old man had known, even then, that his daughter might one day need a weapon that no sword could match. Cressida looked up at Mr. Hale, who stood quietly in the doorway with his hands clasped behind his back. "Begin the formal notices," she said. "Every outstanding bond, every unpaid interest charge, every defaulted term. I want the documents drawn up and dispatched to the Duke within 3 days. Use the chancery stamps. Make it official." Hale gave a single, measured nod. "And if His Grace refuses to acknowledge them?" Cressida gathered the charters carefully and placed them back in the folder. She retied the red cord with steady hands. "Then he will learn what my father always told me, Mr. Hale. A man who does not read his debts will one day be read his sentence." 5 days after the assembly, Peregrine had already rewritten the story of that evening to suit himself. In the smoking rooms of his Pall Mall club, surrounded by men who owed him favors or feared his temper, he leaned back in his leather armchair and described his wife's quiet departure as though it were a charming little episode, the sort of domestic flutter that every married man endured from time to time. "She took herself off to the country," he told Lord Grafton over a glass of brandy. "Probably weeping into her embroidery by now. You know how women are, Grafton. They make a great fuss over nothing, and then they come back with swollen eyes and expect you to feel guilty about it." Grafton, who had been married for 22 years and had never once seated another woman in his wife's chair at a public gathering, said nothing. He simply sipped his drink and studied the fire. Peregrine did not notice the silence. He rarely noticed anything that did not directly serve his opinion of himself. By the 5th day, he had installed Lady Amice in the Grand Wing of Oakhaven Manor. The Grand Wing was the finest part of the estate, a series of high-ceilinged rooms on the eastern side of the house that overlooked the formal gardens and the lake beyond. These rooms had belonged to every Duchess of Oakhaven for generations. Cressida's own writing desk still sat beneath the tall window in the morning room, her ink bottles and correspondence trays arranged neatly on its surface, untouched since she had last used them a week before. Peregrine had the desk moved to a storage room on the 3rd floor. He ordered the housekeeper, Mrs. Calloway, to replace the bed linens with fresh ones and to fill the vases with hothouse orchids instead of the simple wildflowers Cressida had always preferred. Mrs. Calloway carried out his instructions without a word, though the other servants noticed that her jaw was set tight and her eyes had the flat, careful look of a woman saving her real thoughts for later. The household staff at Oakhaven had served Cressida for 6 years. They knew her habits, her kindness, the way she remembered every birthday. They also knew Peregrine, who could not remember the name of the footman who addressed him that morning. The arrival of Lady Amice in the Duchess's rooms sent a cold current through the servants' quarters, and conversations at the kitchen table grew shorter and more guarded. Peregrine, oblivious to all of this, threw himself into a display of domestic authority that bordered on theater. He hosted dinners every evening that week, inviting neighboring landowners and their wives to admire his table, his cellar, and his guest of honor. Lady Amice sat at the foot of the long dining table, elegant and composed, and made polite conversation about music, literature, and the breeding of hunting dogs. She was charming in a measured, careful way that put the wives at ease and kept the husbands at a respectful distance. Peregrine watched her across the candle-lit table each evening and congratulated himself on the arrangement. A beautiful, accomplished woman in his household, a troublesome wife safely out of sight, the world bending itself to his wishes, just as it always had. On the 6th morning, the first letter arrived. It came by private courier on horseback, a sealed envelope of heavy cream paper stamped with a dark red wax seal bearing the Valmont crest, a set of merchant scales balanced above an open book. The courier handed it to the butler, Mr. Pennock, who carried it on a silver tray to the breakfast room, where Peregrine sat eating kedgeree and reading the racing pages of the morning broadsheet. Peregrine glanced at the seal. He recognized it immediately. "Valmont," he muttered, turning the envelope over in his fingers. "What does she want now?" He did not open it. He tossed it across the table, where it landed beside the butter dish, and returned to his newspaper. Probably begging for dress money, or threatening to stay away until Christmas. Let us stew. Mr. Pennock hesitated in the doorway. "Shall I file it with your correspondence, Your Grace?" "Throw it in the fire." Pennock paused for a fraction of a second, a pause so brief that only a man paying close attention would have caught it, and then crossed to the fireplace and placed the unopened letter on the coals. The heavy paper curled, blackened, and vanished in a soft breath of flame. The second letter arrived the following day. Same cream paper, same red seal, same courier on horseback. This time the envelope was thicker, suggesting several pages folded inside. Peregrine was in the billiard room with a glass of port when Pennock brought it in. "Another one from the Valmont offices, Your Grace." "Good Lord, the woman is relentless." Peregrine did not even look up from his shot. "Burn it." The third letter arrived on the 8th morning, and this time it was accompanied by a second envelope addressed to the Steward of Oakhaven Manor in formal legal script. Pennock studied this second envelope with growing unease. The handwriting was not Cressida's. It was the precise, professional hand of a solicitor, and the seal on the back bore the additional stamp of the High Court of Chancery. Pennock carried both letters to the breakfast room, where Peregrine was arguing with Lady Amice about whether to host a shooting party the following weekend. "Your Grace, 2 further letters from the Valmont offices. I should mention that one appears to be of a legal nature. It bears the Chancery stamp." Peregrine waved his fork dismissively. "She has hired some local solicitor to write her complaints for her. It is a performance, Pennock. She wants me to think she is serious, so that I will ride down to Berkshire and beg her to come home. I will do no such thing. Burn them both." Pennock stood very still for a moment. He had served this household for 19 years. He had watched Peregrine's father ignore warnings too, and he remembered vividly where that had led. "Your Grace, with respect, might it be wise to at least—" "I said, burn them." Pennock walked to the fireplace. He placed both letters on the flames and watched them turn to ash, and as the last corner of parchment crumbled into the grate, he felt the particular heaviness of a man who knows that a door has just closed and the person inside does not yet realize the room is getting smaller. By the 9th day, 4 official notices from the Valmont Banking Merchant Guild had been delivered to Oakhaven Manor. Every single one had been destroyed without being read. In Berkshire, Mr. Hale recorded each delivery and each confirmed receipt in a leather-bound ledger with the date, the courier's name, and a single word written in the margin beside every entry: refused. The port of Bristol in the spring of 1843 was a roaring, restless place. Tall masted merchant ships crowded the harbour, their rigging tangled against the grey sky like the bare branches of a winter forest. Dock workers hauled crates of tobacco, sugar, and Indian tea along the stone quays, shouting to one another over the screech of gulls and the constant groan of timber against tide. The smell of salt, tar, and roasting chestnuts from the street vendors drifted through every alley and doorway, and the whole district hummed with the rough, honest energy of commerce. Cressida arrived on the morning of the 9th day, dressed in a plain grey wool travelling coat and a simple bonnet that covered most of her hair. She carried no jewellery except a small silver watch pinned to her lapel, and she walked with the brisk, purposeful stride of a woman who had business to attend to and no interest in being recognized. To anyone glancing at her on the busy quayside, she looked like the wife of a prosperous merchant, respectable, unremarkable, and entirely forgettable. That was the idea. She made her way through the crowded streets to the Custom House, a handsome stone building that overlooked the main harbour basin. The Custom House handled the official paperwork of the port, shipping manifests, cargo inspections, duty payments, and its upper floors contained a row of small private meeting rooms that could be rented by the hour for confidential business discussions. Cressida had booked one of these rooms through Mr. Hale 3 days earlier, using her maiden name. She climbed the narrow staircase to the second floor and found the room at the end of the corridor. It was a modest space, with a single window facing the water, a round table, 2 wooden chairs, and a coal fire burning low in a small iron grate. A pot of tea and 2 cups had already been laid out by the Custom House clerk. Cressida poured herself a cup, sat down, and waited. The door opened 12 minutes later, and Lady Amice walked in. She looked different from the woman who had swept into Hargrove House on Peregrine's arm 9 days ago. The lavender gown and jeweled hair comb were gone, replaced by a sensible dark blue traveling dress with a high collar and plain buttons. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a simple knot, and without the elaborate styling and candlelight of the ballroom, she looked younger, perhaps 25 or 26, and considerably more serious. She closed the door behind her, removed her gloves, and sat down across from Cressida with the ease of someone who had done this before. "He burned every single letter," Cressida said. Amice nodded slowly. "I watched him do it. The butler tried to warn him about the chancery stamps. He would not listen." "Did he suspect anything? About you?" "Nothing at all. He believes I am completely enchanted by him. Last evening he spent 40 minutes telling me about a horse he once rode at Epsom. I believe he expected me to applaud." Cressida allowed herself a brief, dry smile. She reached into a traveling case and withdrew a thin leather folder which she placed on the table between them. "The foreclosure documents are nearly ready. Mr. Hale will file them with the Chancery Court by the end of next week. Once that happens, the legal process cannot be reversed." Amice studied the folder for a moment, then looked up. "And my part? Is it finished?" "Almost. I need you at Oakhaven for 6 more days. Keep him comfortable, keep him distracted, and above all, keep him away from London. If he visits his bankers before the filing is complete, there is a small chance his solicitor could delay the proceedings." 6 days. Amice considered this. "He is planning a shooting party on Saturday. That should occupy him through the weekend at least." "Good. After the filing, you are free to leave. The arrangements we discussed are already in place." This was the agreement that no one in London society, no one at the Mayfair Assembly, and certainly not the Duke of Oakhaven himself, had ever come close to guessing. Lady Amice Ferris was not Peregrine's mistress. She had never been his mistress. She had never had the slightest romantic interest in him, and the performance at Hargrove House, the entrance on his arm, the seating at the head table, the lavender gown and practiced smile, had been exactly that, a performance. Carefully rehearsed, precisely timed, and commissioned months in advance by the one person everyone assumed was its victim. Cressida had found Amice through a discreet inquiry made by Mr. Hale the previous autumn. Amice was the eldest daughter of a baronet whose estate in Dorset had collapsed under the weight of bad investments and an unfortunate fondness for French brandy. Her father had died owing money to half the county, leaving Amice and her 2 younger sisters with a good name, an excellent education, and almost nothing else. She had been living in a rented cottage near Sherborne, teaching pianoforte to the daughters of local tradesmen to keep food on the table, when Hale's letter arrived. The offer was straightforward. Cressida needed a woman of breeding and intelligence to play a specific role for a limited period of time. The role required social grace, a convincing manner, and absolute discretion. In return, Amice would receive a sum generous enough to purchase a modest country property and provide for her sisters' futures. Amice had accepted within a week. The 2 women had met privately on 4 occasions over the winter, always in quiet, out-of-the-way locations: a solicitor's office in Reading, a tea room in Bath, a private parlour at a coaching inn near Salisbury. Cressida had explained the situation with the calm precision of a woman laying out a business proposal, and Amice had listened with the sharp attention of someone who understood exactly what it meant to be trapped by circumstance and overlooked by the world. They had planned every detail together: the timing of the entrance at the assembly, the choice of gown, the exact shade of familiarity Amice would adopt with Peregrine, warm enough to suggest intimacy, restrained enough to maintain her own dignity. They had even anticipated Cressida's public departure and the ring left on the tablecloth, knowing that the gesture would be interpreted by the gossips of Mayfair as the heartbroken retreat of a humiliated wife. Nobody had considered the possibility that a woman walking quietly out of a ballroom might be walking toward something rather than away from it. Amice finished her tea and set the cup down. I should return before evening. He will notice if I am gone too long. Take the afternoon coach from Temple Meads. You will be back at Oakhaven by nightfall. Cressida paused, then added, Thank you, Emmis. I know this has not been pleasant. Emmis stood and pulled on her gloves. She looked at Cressida for a long moment, and something passed between them, a quiet understanding between two women who had both learned, in very different ways, what it cost to survive in a world that measured their worth by the men standing beside them. It has been the most profitable month of my life, Emmis said evenly, and honestly, the horse story was not even his worst. She gave a small, precise nod, opened the door, and disappeared down the corridor toward the staircase. Cressida listened to her footsteps fade, then turned to the window and looked out at the busy harbor below, where the merchant ships rocked gently on the incoming tide, and the cranes swung their heavy loads from dock to deck without rest. She had 6 days. 6 days before the trap closed completely, and Peregrine discovered that the ground beneath his feet had been hollow all along. Peregrine returned to London on the 15th day in excellent spirits. The shooting party at Oakhaven had been a tremendous success. 12 brace of pheasant, a fine lunch served on the south lawn, and enough claret to float a small barge. His guests had praised his hospitality, admired his grounds, and laughed generously at his jokes, which was all Peregrine ever really required from an afternoon. He had come to town for 2 reasons. The first was a gambling debt of considerable size owed to Sir Rowland Hatch, a sharp-eyed baronet who played cards the way a surgeon used a knife, with patience, precision, and no sympathy whatsoever. Peregrine had lost badly at 21 3 weeks earlier, and Hatch was not the sort of man who allowed debts to linger. The amount was £400, which Peregrine considered an irritation rather than a crisis. The second reason was a diamond brooch he had seen in the window of Rundle and Bridge on Ludgate Hill. It was a delicate spray of stones set in white gold, shaped like a cluster of forget-me-nots, and he intended to purchase it for Amice as a token of his appreciation for her charming company. He imagined presenting it to her over dinner, watching her face light up, and feeling that particular warmth of satisfaction that came from being generous with other people's money. Because that, of course, was what it had always been. Other people's money. Though Peregrine had never allowed himself to think of it in those terms, he arrived at his Mayfair townhouse shortly after noon, changed into a fresh coat, and instructed his valet to have the carriage brought round. His first stop would be the banking house of Coutts and Harley on the Strand, where the Blackwell family had maintained their accounts for 2 generations. He would draw the funds for Hatch's debt and the brooch in a single visit, settle both matters before tea, and be back at his club in time for the evening. The banking house occupied a tall, narrow building wedged between a solicitor's office and a linen draper's shop. Its ground floor was fitted out in dark oak paneling and green baize, with a long counter behind which 3 clerks sat on high stools, scratching figures into enormous ledgers with steel nib pens. The air smelled of ink, old paper, and the faintly metallic scent of coin. Peregrine strode in with the confidence of a man who had never once been refused anything in a bank. He approached the senior clerk, a thin, precise man named Cheswick, who had handled the Blackwell accounts for the past 8 years and placed both hands flat on the counter. Cheswick, I need a draft for £400 drawn on the main account and a further £150 for a personal purchase. Quick as you can, there's a good fellow. I have appointments. Cheswick looked up from his ledger. There was something in his expression that Peregrine did not immediately recognize. A careful, guarded stillness, like a man choosing his words the way a person might choose their footing on a frozen lake. Your Grace, if you would be kind enough to step into the private office, Mr. Harley would like to speak with you directly. Peregrine frowned. In 15 years of banking with this firm, he had spoken to the senior partner exactly twice. Once when his father died, and once when he needed a loan to renovate the east wing of Oakhaven. Senior partners did not involve themselves in routine withdrawals. Their appearance meant complications, and Peregrine had no appetite for complications today. Whatever Harley wants to discuss, he can send me a letter. I simply need the drafts, Chiswick. I am afraid the drafts cannot be issued at this time, Your Grace. Chiswick's voice was level, almost apologetic, but there was a firmness beneath it that stopped Peregrine's next words in his throat. Mr. Harley will explain, if you will follow me. The private office was a small, oak-paneled room at the back of the building, furnished with a heavy desk, 2 leather chairs, and a portrait of the firm's founder hanging above the mantelpiece. Mr. Harley stood behind the desk, a stout, gray-whiskered man in his 60s who wore a plain black coat and a pair of spectacles pushed up onto his forehead. He did not smile when Peregrine entered. He did not offer him a seat. Your Grace, I will come to the matter directly. As of yesterday afternoon, all credit lines extended to the Blackwell Duchy accounts have been formally terminated. The words landed in the room like stones dropped into still water. Peregrine stared at him. Terminated? What on earth are you talking about? Harley opened a folder on his desk and turned it so Peregrine could see the documents inside. We have received formal notification from the Valmont Banking Merchant Guild that all outstanding loans secured against the Blackwell estates are now in default. Interest payments have not been met for the current quarter, and the Valmont Guild has exercised its contractual right to call in the full principal on every outstanding bond. That is absurd. My wife manages those arrangements. She handles the household accounts, the estate payments, Your wife, Your Grace, is the Valmont Guild. Or rather, the loans in question were drawn from her personal trust, established under the terms of your marriage settlement. The settlement you signed in 1837. Peregrine opened his mouth, then closed it again. The marriage settlement. He had a vague memory of a thick document placed in front of him on his wedding morning. Pages of dense legal script that he had waved through with a signature and a joke about lawyers earning their fees. Harley continued, his voice carrying the particular steadiness of a man delivering news he had rehearsed. The Valmont Guild has filed formal notice with the Chancery Court. Every mortgage held against your London townhouses, your carriages, your club memberships, and the Oakhaven estate itself is now subject to immediate repayment. Until those debts are settled or a new arrangement is reached, this bank is legally unable to extend any further credit to your accounts. Peregrine gripped the back of the leather chair in front of him. His knuckles were white. The room, which had seemed perfectly ordinary a minute ago, now felt as though its walls had shifted inward by several inches. How much? He asked. His voice came out quieter than he intended. Harley removed his spectacles and polished them slowly with a cloth from his breast pocket. It was the gesture of a man buying himself a moment before delivering the final stroke. The total outstanding principal, including accumulated interest and penalty charges for the missed quarter, currently stands at £47,000. The number hung in the air between them. £47,000. A sum that could purchase a country estate, fund a regiment, or build a merchant fleet from keel to mast. A sum that Peregrine did not have, had never had, and could not raise if he sold everything he owned twice over. He left the banking house 20 minutes later without the drafts, without the brooch, and without the particular expression of easy superiority that had accompanied him through every doorway for the past 36 years. The afternoon sun was bright on the Strand, and the carriages and pedestrians moved past him in their usual busy patterns, entirely unaware that the tall, well-dressed Duke, standing motionless on the pavement, had just discovered that the fortune he had spent his entire adult life enjoying had never actually belonged to him at all. Peregrine rode for Oakhaven as though the devil himself was seated behind him in the saddle. He left London before dawn on the 16th day, abandoning his carriage in favor of a fast horse hired from a livery stable near Hyde Park Corner. The animal was a tall bay gelding with a rough mouth and a hard gallop, and Peregrine drove it mercilessly along the Western Road, stopping only once at a coaching inn in Reading to water the horse and swallow a glass of ale that he barely tasted. His mind was a furnace of calculations he could not complete. £47,000. The number circled inside his skull like a trapped bird, battering against every wall. He had always known, in some vague and comfortable way, that the estate carried debts. His father had mentioned them occasionally, the way a man might mention a distant relative who caused mild embarrassment at family gatherings. Something acknowledged, shrugged at, and promptly set aside. Peregrine had assumed the debts were manageable. He had assumed Cressida's family money covered the interest payments the way rain filled a garden barrel. Quietly, reliably, without anyone needing to think about it. He had assumed a great many things. Every single one of them was now falling apart beneath his feet, like rotten floorboards. The ride from London to Oakhaven took the better part of a day, and by the time the familiar oak-lined avenue came into view through the late afternoon haze, Peregrine's legs ached, his back was stiff, and his temper had sharpened to a dangerous edge. He would go to his study, pour himself a large whiskey, summon his own solicitor from the village, and begin untangling this mess. Cressida was bluffing. She had to be. No woman would actually destroy her own husband's estate simply because he had seated another lady at his dinner table. It was a negotiating tactic, a show of force designed to frighten him into an apology. He would find the weak point in her legal position, apply the right pressure, and restore order within the week. That was the plan. It survived exactly as long as it took him to reach the front gates. The gates of Oakhaven Manor were closed. This was unusual. In the 6 years Peregrine had lived there, the wrought iron gates at the entrance to the main drive had stood open from dawn until dusk, a symbol of the Duke's hospitality and his family's long-standing welcome to visitors, tenants, and tradespeople. To find them shut in the middle of the afternoon was like finding a familiar face wearing an unfamiliar expression, unsettling in a way that was difficult to name. Peregrine dismounted and pushed at the gates. They did not move. A heavy chain had been looped through the ironwork and secured with a padlock the size of a man's fist. "Open these gates!" he shouted toward the lodge house that stood just inside the entrance. "Brewer, where the devil are you?" The lodge-keeper's door remained shut. No face appeared at its window. The only sound was the rustling of the chestnut trees that lined the drive and the distant bleating of sheep in the lower pasture. Peregrine climbed the low stone wall beside the gate, an indignity that would have appalled him under any other circumstance, and walked up the gravel drive toward the house. The first thing he noticed was the noise. Oakhaven Manor was normally a quiet place in the afternoons, its rhythms governed by the steady tick of domestic routine. Today, the courtyard was loud with voices, footsteps, and the scraping of heavy objects being moved across stone. He rounded the final curve of the drive and stopped. The courtyard in front of the main house was full of people. 12 or 15 men moved between the front doors and a line of carts parked along the gravel sweep, carrying items out of the house and loading them with the careful, methodical efficiency of workers who had done this many times before. Peregrine watched as 2 men emerged from the front hall, carrying a large painting in a gilded frame, the Van Dyck portrait of the 3rd Duke that had hung above the main staircase for 140 years. Behind them, another pair carried a wooden crate packed with straw, from which the curved handle of a silver serving tureen protruded, like the neck of a swan peering out of its nest. Standing in the center of this organized dismantling, holding a leather-bound inventory ledger and a pencil, was a tall, angular man in a black coat whom Peregrine had never seen before. Beside him stood 2 uniformed bailiffs of the county court, each wearing the official brass badge of their office on their lapels. Peregrine strode forward. "What is happening here? Who gave you authority to touch my property?" The tall man looked up from his ledger with the measured calm of someone who had been expecting this interruption. "Your Grace, my name is Carstairs. I am senior solicitor to the Valmont Banking Merchant Guild, acting under the authority of a seizure order granted by the High Court of Chancery 4 days ago." He reached into his coat and produced a folded document, which he offered to Peregrine. "This is your copy of the order. You will find it details the specific items to be catalogued and seized in partial satisfaction of the outstanding debts owed by the Blackwell Duchy to the Valmont Trust. Peregrine snatched the document and unfolded it. The legal language swam before his eyes, whereas and hereinafter and pursuant to the terms, but certain phrases leapt out with terrible clarity. Default of interest payments. Formal notices delivered and refused. Seizure of chattels to the estimated value of £6,000. "This is robbery," Peregrine said, his voice rising. "You cannot walk into a duke's home and strip it bare on the word of some merchant banker." Carstairs did not flinch. "The court order is valid, Your Grace. 4 separate notices were delivered to this address over the past week. Our records show that each was received by your household, and none was answered. Under the terms of the original loan agreements, failure to respond to formal notice within 7 days constitutes acceptance of default. The Chancery Court reviewed the evidence and granted the seizure order without objection." The burned letters, the cream envelopes with the red wax seals that Peregrine had tossed into the fire without a second thought. Each one had been a warning, a chance to respond, a door held open for him to walk through. He had set fire to every single one, and now the ashes of those letters were falling around him in the form of bailiffs and inventory clerks, carrying his family's silver out the front door. He stood in his own courtyard, holding the seizure order in both hands, and watched as the workers continued their steady procession in and out of the house. The Van Dyke was already on the cart, wrapped in blankets and tied down with rope. A crate of wine from the cellar followed it. Then a set of Georgian candlesticks. Then a mahogany writing desk that had belonged to his grandmother. Piece by piece, the contents of Oakhaven Manor were being loaded onto carts and driven away down the chestnut-lined avenue, and Peregrine could do nothing but stand there and watch his inheritance leave through the front gate. Somerset in late spring was a gentle county. The hills rolled softly into one another like green waves frozen mid-swell, and the hedgerows bloomed with hawthorn and dogrose, filling the lanes with a sweet, heavy perfume that clung to clothing and hair long after a traveller had passed through. It was the sort of landscape that invited slowness, contemplation, and the quiet mending of things that had come apart elsewhere. Peregrine had no interest in any of it. He rode into Somerset on the 23rd day with the grim determination of a man clutching at the last rope on a sinking vessel. Everything in London had collapsed around him with a speed that still made his head spin. His credit was gone. His townhouse was under threat. His club had quietly declined to serve him dinner the previous evening, citing an administrative matter that nobody was willing to explain in detail. Old friends crossed the street when they saw him coming. Invitations had stopped arriving at his door. He needed an ally, and Amice was the only person he could think of who might still be on his side. He had sent word ahead to her family's address in Somerset, a modest stone farmhouse on the outskirts of a village called Langport, where Amice had told him her widowed aunt lived. The house was easy enough to find, sitting at the end of a dirt lane behind a low wall of dry stone, with chickens scratching in the front yard and a thin column of smoke rising from the chimney. Peregrine tied his horse to the gatepost and knocked on the front door. It was opened by a young housemaid with flour on her apron and a look of mild alarm at finding a well-dressed gentleman on the doorstep. "I am looking for Lady Amice Ferris. I was told she is staying here." The maid bobbed a curtsy and led him through a narrow hallway to a small sitting room at the back of the house. The room was simply furnished: a faded sofa, a writing table beneath the window, a bookshelf filled with volumes of poetry and natural history. Amice was seated at the writing table, dressed in a plain muslin day dress, her auburn hair loose around her shoulders. She was sealing a letter when he entered, and she looked up at him with an expression that held neither surprise nor warmth. "Peregrine." She said his name the way a person might name a species of bird they had been expecting to see in a particular field: factual, detached, Amos, thank God. I have been trying to reach you for 3 days. Everything has fallen apart. Cressida has gone mad. She has called in every loan, frozen my accounts, sent bailiffs to strip the manor. I need your help. I need someone who can speak to her, reason with her, make her understand that this has gone far enough. Amos set down her pen and folded her hands in her lap. She studied him for a long moment, and something in her gaze made Peregrine feel, for the first time, that he was being looked at rather than looked up to. "Sit down," she said quietly. He sat on the faded sofa, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "If you could write to her, perhaps, or visit her in Berkshire, woman to woman, she might listen to you. She might—" "Peregrine?" Amos's voice was calm and even. "There is something I need to give you before this conversation goes any further." She opened the drawer of the writing table and withdrew a document, several pages of heavy legal paper, folded and bound with a blue ribbon. A large red seal was pressed into the bottom of the first page, and Peregrine recognized it immediately. The seal of the High Court of Chancery. Amos held the document out to him. He took it slowly, the way a man might take hold of something he suspects is hot. He unfolded the pages and began to read. The language was dense and formal, but certain words surfaced through the legal thicket with painful clarity. Contract of engagement. Commissioned by Duchess Cressida Blackwell, née Valmont. Services rendered, the performance of a social role for a period not exceeding 60 days. Compensation, the sum of £2,000, payable upon completion. Peregrine read the passage twice. Then he read it a third time, because the first 2 readings had produced a conclusion that his mind refused to accept. He looked up at Amos. His face had gone the color of old candle wax. "You were hired," he said. The words came out flat, stripped of everything except disbelief. "I was hired," Amos confirmed, "by your wife 5 months ago. My instructions were to present myself as your romantic companion at the London Assembly, to maintain the appearance of an intimate attachment for the following weeks, and to keep you occupied at Oakhaven while the legal proceedings were prepared." Peregrine stared at her. The sitting room, with its faded furniture and its smell of wood smoke and old books, seemed to tilt slightly around him. Every evening he had spent in Amos's company, the dinners, the conversations, the shooting party, the quiet walks through the Oakhaven gardens, rearranged themselves in his memory like pieces of a puzzle being turned the right way up for the first time. "The assembly," he said slowly. "The entrance, the lavender gown, you sitting in Cressida's chair. All of it was arranged. All of it. And you were never—" He stopped. The question was too humiliating to finish. "I was never anything to you except a paid contractor, Peregrine. I am sorry for the deception, though I suspect you will find the apology insufficient." Peregrine stood up. The affidavit crumpled slightly in his grip. He wanted to shout, to throw the document into the fireplace, to overturn the writing table and demand that someone, anyone, tell him that this was a mistake, a forgery, a cruel joke played by enemies he did not know he had. But the Chancery seal was real. The signatures were real. And the woman, sitting calmly at the writing table, watching him with steady, unapologetic eyes, was very clearly telling the truth. "Where is she?" he asked. "Where is Cressida now?" "I do not know her exact location. Our arrangement did not require me to track her movements after the filing." Amos paused, then added, "I am leaving for Scotland this afternoon. There is a small property near Edinburgh that I have purchased with my earnings. My sisters will join me there next month." She stood, crossed to the door, and opened it. The meaning was clear. Peregrine walked out of the farmhouse and stood in the lane beside his horse, holding a legal document that proved his wife had outmaneuvered him so completely that even the woman he thought was his closest companion had been working for her from the very beginning. The chickens continued scratching in the yard. The smoke continued rising from the chimney. Somerset continued being gentle and green and entirely indifferent to his ruin. He had no one left to turn to, and for the first time since the night of the assembly, Peregrine Blackwell began to understand that he never had. The road from Somerset to Cornwall was long, rough, and unkind to a man in a hurry. It wound through the hills of Devon like a river that could not make up its mind, climbing over moorland and dropping into wooded valleys before climbing again, and the coaching inns along the way grew smaller and rougher the further west one travelled. By the time Peregrine crossed the Tamar River on the 28th day, his horse was lame, his coat was caked with dust, and his boots had not been properly cleaned in a week. He had spent 5 days on the road, sleeping in whatever inn had a room available, eating whatever was placed in front of him, and thinking the same thoughts in an endless, grinding circle. £47,000. The affidavit, the burned letters, the bailiffs in his courtyard, Lady Amice sitting at her writing table in Somerset, calm as a schoolmistress, explaining that she had been paid £2,000 to make a fool of him. Every thought led back to the same destination, and that destination was Cressida. He had learned her location from his own solicitor in London, a nervous, apologetic man named Phelps, who had delivered the information as though handing over a live coal. The Duchess was in Cornwall, managing her late father's commercial interests at the deep-water shipping port of St. Jude, a small but busy harbour on the southern coast that handled tin exports and coastal trade. The Valmont family had owned the port and its associated buildings for 3 generations, and Cressida had inherited it directly through her father's will, entirely outside the Blackwell estate. Peregrine's plan, such as it was, relied on confrontation. He would ride to Cornwall, demand a private audience with his wife, and use every tool at his disposal: persuasion, authority, marital right, the weight of his name and title, to force a compromise before the Chancery Court reached its final ruling. If he could convince Cressida to withdraw the foreclosure claim, or even to delay it, he might salvage enough of the estate to maintain his position. A reduced income, perhaps, a smaller household. Painful concessions, certainly, but survivable. The alternative was complete ruin, and that was something Peregrine's mind simply could not accommodate. He was the Duke of Oakhaven. His family had held the title for 9 generations. The idea that all of it could be swept away by a woman with a ledger and a solicitor was so foreign to his understanding of the world that he kept rejecting it, the way the body rejects a splinter, pushing it out, refusing to let it settle. Cornwall greeted him with rain. A steady, determined downpour that began somewhere around Bodmin and followed him all the way to the coast, turning the roads to mud and soaking through his coat until his shirt clung to his back like a second skin. The landscape grew wilder as he rode south. Granite farmhouses, stone-walled fields, gorse bushes blazing yellow against the grey sky. The trees thinned and bent eastward, shaped by years of Atlantic wind, and the air tasted of salt long before the sea came into view. He reached the outskirts of St. Jude in the late afternoon. The village was a cluster of whitewashed cottages and grey stone buildings, arranged along a steep hillside that dropped down to the harbour. The port itself was protected by a natural breakwater of dark rock, and inside its shelter sat a dozen or so vessels: fishing boats, coastal traders, and 2 larger merchant ships with their sails furled and their decks stacked with crates. Above the harbour, set back from the quayside on a raised stone terrace, stood the Valmont Admiralty Building. It was an imposing structure for such a small port. 3 stories of solid granite with tall sash windows and a slate roof, its front door flanked by 2 iron lanterns that burned steadily against the rain. A brass plate beside the door read, "Valmont Maritime Holdings, established 1798. This was the headquarters of Cressida's shipping enterprise, and Peregrine could see lights burning in the upper windows despite the late hour. He stabled his horse at the inn on the harbour road, a low, beamed place called the Anchor that smelled of pipe smoke and fish stew, and took a room for the night. He ordered a hot bath, a cold supper, and a bottle of claret, and sat in the tin tub beside the fire while the rain hammered against the window and the wind moaned through the chimney. Tomorrow he would go to the Admiralty building and demand to see his wife. He would remind her of her duties, her vows, her obligations as a married woman under English law. He would make her understand that she had made her point and that it was time to step back from the edge before they both went over. He rehearsed the conversation in his head as the bathwater cooled around him. He would be firm, reasonable. He would acknowledge that the business at the assembly had been poorly handled, a regrettable lapse of judgment, nothing more. He would offer to dismiss Amis from the household, unaware that Amis had already dismissed herself and was halfway to Scotland. He would propose a fresh arrangement, a new understanding between husband and wife, one that restored the natural order of things and put this ugly chapter behind them. The words sounded strong and convincing inside his own head. They always did. Peregrine had spent his entire life inside his own head, and the acoustics there were excellent. Every argument he made echoed back to him as wisdom. Every decision he took sounded like leadership, and every excuse he offered rang with the clear tone of perfect reason. The trouble was that Cressida had stopped listening to the sound of his voice months ago. She had been listening instead to the sound of numbers, and numbers did not echo. They simply added up. He finished his supper, drank most of the claret, and fell asleep in the narrow inn bed with his wet boots drying by the fire and the rain still falling outside, steady and patient, and showing no sign of stopping. In the Valmont Admiralty building, 300 yards up the hill, a lamp burned in the second-floor office where Cressida sat at her father's old oak desk, reviewing the final set of documents that Mr. Hale had sent down by express courier that morning. The foreclosure deed was complete. The court filing was scheduled. Every figure was checked. Every clause was sound. Every legal door that Peregrine might try to push open had been locked, bolted, and bricked over from the inside. She knew he was coming. Mr. Hale's network of contacts had tracked his journey from Somerset through Devon and into Cornwall with the steady efficiency of a postal service. She knew he had arrived at St. Jude. She knew he was staying at the Anchor. She knew he would come to the Admiralty building in the morning with his jaw set and his arguments ready. She also knew, with the certainty of a woman who had studied every inch of the ground she stood on, that his arguments would make no difference at all. The rain had stopped by morning, and the harbour of St. Jude lay still and silver under a pale sky washed clean by the night's storm. Fishing boats rocked gently on the incoming tide, and the gulls wheeled overhead in wide, lazy circles, their cries carrying across the water like the voices of old women calling to each other from neighbouring windows. Peregrine walked up the cobbled hill to the Valmont Admiralty building shortly after 9 o'clock. He had dressed with care, his best remaining coat, a clean cravat, his hair brushed and his boots polished by the inn's boy for a penny. He wanted to look like what he was, a duke, a man of standing, a husband exercising his rightful authority. He wanted Cressida to see him and remember what she had married. The front door of the Admiralty building was open. He stepped into a ground-floor entrance hall of polished stone, where a wide staircase rose to the upper floors, and a large framed map of the Atlantic shipping routes covered most of the far wall. The hall smelled of sealing wax, rope, and the faint, briny dampness that seeped into every building within 100 yards of the Cornish coast. A clerk sat behind a tall desk near the foot of the stairs, a young man with sandy hair and ink-stained fingers who looked up when Peregrine entered and immediately got to his feet. "I am the Duke of Oakhaven," Peregrine announced. "I am here to see my wife, the Duchess. You will inform her that I am waiting." The clerk, whose name, as Peregrine did not bother to learn, was Tobias March, studied the Duke with the particular expression of a man who had been given very specific instructions and intended to follow them exactly. "Good morning, Your Grace. If you would care to wait here, I will inquire upstairs." March disappeared up the staircase, and Peregrine stood in the entrance hall, examining the shipping map with an air of impatient authority. He could hear footsteps and muffled voices on the floors above, the scrape of chairs, the opening and closing of doors. The building was clearly busy, clerks and agents going about the daily business of managing a commercial port, and Peregrine felt a flicker of irritation that his wife's time was occupied by this sort of common mercantile activity, when she ought to be attending to the far more pressing matter of their marriage. March returned after several minutes. He was not alone. Walking beside him was a man Peregrine did not recognize, a heavy-set, broad-shouldered fellow in his 50s, with a weathered face, thick grey eyebrows, and the rough, capable hands of someone who had spent time working on docks before he had graduated to working behind desks. This was Mr. Samuel Trench, the head clerk and port manager of the Valmont shipping operation at St. Jude, and he carried himself with the calm, grounded assurance of a man who was very good at his job and knew it.
"Your Grace," Trench said, offering a brief bow that was precisely polite and not a fraction deeper. "I am Samuel Trench, the head clerk of this office. How may I assist you?" "You may assist me by bringing me to my wife. I did not ride 3 counties to speak with a clerk." Trench did not react to the sharpness in Peregrine's voice. He had spent 30 years managing dockhands, ship captains, and customs officials, and a rude duke was hardly the most difficult personality he had encountered before breakfast. "I regret that the Duchess is not available for a meeting this morning, Your Grace. She has asked me to convey her response to your visit." Trench reached into the leather satchel that hung from his shoulder and produced a document, a thick fold of legal paper bound with red cord and sealed with the Valmont crest in dark wax. He held it out to Peregrine with both hands, the way a butler might present a letter on a silver tray. Peregrine took the document and broke the seal. Inside were 6 pages of closely written legal text, and clipped to the front page was a short, handwritten note in Cressida's neat, slanting script. He read the note first. It contained exactly 3 sentences. "This is the final foreclosure deed for the Oakhaven estate, executed under the authority of the Valmont Banking Merchant Guild and filed with the High Court of Chancery. Your legal rights to any financial interest in my personal trust were permanently severed on the evening of April the 14th, when you publicly abandoned your marital duties at the Hargrove Assembly. There is nothing further to discuss." April the 14th. The night of the ball. The night he had walked through the doors of Hargrove House with Amos on his arm and seated her in his wife's chair while 300 people watched. That single evening, those few careless, arrogant minutes had been the hinge on which everything turned. Cressida's solicitors had used his public conduct as the legal trigger for severing the financial bonds of the marriage, and the Chancery Court had accepted it. Peregrine looked up from the note. Trench stood before him, solid and unmoved, his expression carrying the particular neutrality of a man who was neither enjoying this moment nor wishing it were different. "She will not even come downstairs," Peregrine said. It was not a question. "The Duchess has communicated everything she wishes to communicate, Your Grace. The document in your hands contains the full details of the foreclosure, including the schedule of debt repayment and the legal process that will follow. I am instructed to recommend that you share it with your own solicitor at your earliest convenience." Peregrine stood in the entrance hall of his wife's building, holding the document that described the end of his family's fortune, and looked up at the ceiling as though he might somehow see through the plaster and floorboards to the office above, where Cressida sat at her desk, working, breathing, existing barely 20 feet above his head, and yet as unreachable as if she were on the far side of the ocean, mapped on the wall behind him. She had not come down. She had not raised her voice, made a scene, shed a tear, or uttered a single word in his presence since the night she had placed the crest ring on the tablecloth and walked out of Hargrove House. Every blow she had struck had been delivered through paper and ink, through solicitors, clerks, court filings, and the cold, impersonal machinery of law and finance. She had dismantled his world without ever once looking him in the eye. And that, Peregrine realized as he stood in the entrance hall with the foreclosure deed growing heavy in his hands, was the most devastating part of all. He had expected a fight. He had prepared for anger, tears, accusations, the kind of emotional confrontation that a man like him knew how to deflect and dismiss. He had his responses ready, his charm, his authority, his talent for making a woman feel that her grievances were slightly unreasonable. Cressida had denied him even that. She had simply walked away and let the numbers speak for themselves, and the numbers had said everything there was to say. Peregrine folded the document carefully, placed it inside his coat, and walked out of the Admiralty building into the pale Cornish morning.
The harbour below was coming to life, dockhands loading cargo, a merchant brig easing out past the breakwater with its sails catching the first of the breeze, and the world continued about its business as though nothing of consequence had happened inside the granite building on the hill. He mounted his horse at the anchor and rode out of St. Jude without looking back, carrying with him the knowledge that the woman he had underestimated for 6 years had just closed the last door he had left to knock on. The High Court of Chancery occupied a wing of the great legal complex at Lincoln's Inn, in the heart of London. Its principal courtroom was a tall, wood-panelled chamber with a vaulted ceiling and narrow windows that admitted just enough light to read by and not quite enough to feel cheerful about. The benches were old and dark, worn smooth by generations of litigants who had sat upon them and waited for judgments that would shape the rest of their lives.
The room smelled of dusty law books, lamp oil, and the faint, anxious perspiration of people with a great deal to lose. Peregrine arrived on the morning of the 40th day, accompanied by his solicitor, Phelps, and a barrister named Whitmore, whom Phelps had engaged at considerable expense and very short notice. Whitmore was a lean, sharp-featured man with a reputation for finding procedural loopholes in commercial cases, and Peregrine had placed his last remaining hopes in the man's ability to find a crack in Cressida's legal position that could be prized open wide enough to save the estate. The courtroom was already half full when they entered. Several clerks from the Chancery office sat at a long table beneath the judge's bench, sorting papers and whispering to one another. A handful of spectators occupied the public gallery, lawyers from neighboring chambers who had heard about the case and come to watch, and 2 or 3 journalists from the London papers who had caught the scent of a story involving a duke, a duchess, and a very large sum of money. Cressida was not present. Her legal team occupied a bench on the left side of the courtroom. Mr. Hale, the gray-haired Valmont solicitor, flanked by 2 junior clerks and a barrister of her own, a formidable woman named Mrs. Hartley Wells, who was one of the very few female legal advocates permitted to argue before the Chancery Court. Mrs. Hartley Wells was a stout, silver-haired woman in her 60s who wore her court robes with the ease of someone who had been wearing them longer than most of her male colleagues. She sat with her hands folded over a thick leather folder and a calm expression that suggested she had already reached her conclusions about this case and was merely waiting for the formalities to confirm them. The High Chancellor entered, a tall, thin man named Lord Eversham, who wore the traditional black robes of his office and carried himself with the weary patience of someone who had spent 40 years listening to wealthy people argue about money. He took his seat, adjusted his spectacles, and nodded for the proceedings to begin. Whitmore opened Peregrine's case with energy and precision. He argued that the foreclosure was premature, that the Duke had not been given adequate time to respond to the default notices, and that the original loan agreements contained ambiguities that required further examination before any seizure of ancestral property could be authorized. He spoke well, his voice carrying through the courtroom with the practiced rhythm of a man accustomed to making weak arguments sound stronger than they were. Then Mrs. Hartley Wells stood up, and the temperature in the courtroom seemed to drop by several degrees. She began by placing 4 documents on the clerk's table, one beside the other in a neat row. Each was a receipt, signed by the courier service that had delivered the Valmont Guild's formal notices to Oakhaven Manor, confirming the date, time, and recipient of each delivery. Beside each receipt, she placed a corresponding entry from Mr. Hale's ledger, showing the word refused
written in the margin.
"The Duke received 4 separate notices over a period of 9 days," she said, addressing the Chancellor directly. Each notice was hand-delivered to his household and acknowledged by his staff. The Duke chose to destroy every one of them without reading their contents. "This is not a case of inadequate notice, my lord. This is a case of willful refusal." She then produced the original loan charters, the same documents Cressida had reviewed in the Berkshire vault on the second day. She walked the Chancellor through each one, explaining the terms, the interest schedules, and the critical detail that every penny had come from the Duchess's personal trust rather than from the Guild's general fund. She showed him the marriage settlement that Peregrine had signed in 1837, with its clear clause protecting the trust from any claim by the husband. "The Duke signed this settlement on the morning of his wedding," Mrs. Hartley-Wells said. "He did not read it. This is a recurring pattern, my lord. The Duke does not read things. He did not read his marriage settlement. He did not read his default notices. He has come to this court today hoping that his failure to read will somehow be treated as a defense rather than what it plainly is, negligence." Whitmore objected. The Chancellor overruled him. Mrs. Hartley-Wells then presented the final piece of evidence, a detailed accounting of every interest payment that had been due on the Blackwell loans over the past 2 years, showing that Cressida had been making those payments herself from her trust until the quarter preceding the London Assembly. She had stopped the payments deliberately, knowing that the resulting default would trigger the foreclosure clause in the original charters. Every step had been planned, documented, and executed with the precision of a military campaign. The Chancellor reviewed the documents for nearly an hour. He asked several questions, most of them directed at Whitmore, who answered with decreasing confidence as the weight of the evidence settled over the courtroom like snow on a weak roof. At 20 minutes past noon, Lord Eversham removed his spectacles, folded them carefully, and delivered his ruling. The foreclosure was valid. The default notices had been properly served and willfully ignored. The original loan agreements were binding, and the marriage settlement clearly protected the Duchess's personal trust from any spousal claim. The entire Oakhaven estate, its lands, buildings, tenant farms, and remaining contents, was to be placed under the sole management of the Valmont Banking Merchant Guild for the purpose of satisfying the outstanding debt. The Duke's ancestral rights to the property were formally extinguished. The Chancellor spoke these words in the same measured tone he might have used to read a shipping manifest. There was no drama in his voice, no sense of occasion. It was simply the law doing what the law does when someone ignores it for long enough. Peregrine sat on the bench and listened to the ruling, with the blank, fixed expression of a man watching his own house burn from across a field. Phelps touched his elbow gently. Whitmore began gathering his papers with the quiet efficiency of a man who had already moved on to his next case. In the public gallery, one of the journalists was writing rapidly in a small notebook. The story would appear in 3 London papers by the following morning. 45 days after the night of the Hargrove Assembly, a carriage rolled up the chestnut-lined avenue of Oakhaven Manor on a warm June morning. It was a fine carriage, polished black with brass fittings and the Valmont crest painted in gold on its doors. And it was drawn by a pair of matched grey horses that moved with the smooth, unhurried stride of animals that had never been whipped and never needed to be. The gates stood open. The chain and padlock had been removed, and the lodge-keeper, old Brewer, was standing at his post beside the gatehouse with his hat in his hands and a look on his weathered face that fell somewhere between relief and ceremony. He bowed as the carriage passed through, and his wife, who was watching from the lodge window, pressed her hand to her mouth and turned away. The avenue was beautiful in June. The chestnut trees had come into full leaf, and their broad green canopy arched over the gravel drive like the ceiling of a cathedral, dappling the ground with coins of golden sunlight. The parkland on either side was lush with new grass, and a herd of fallow deer grazed near the lake, lifting their heads briefly to watch the carriage pass, before returning to their breakfast. At the end of the avenue, Oakhaven Manor rose against the blue sky with the solid, unhurried grandeur of a house that had stood on the same ground for 200 years. Its honey-colored stone glowed in the morning light, and its tall windows reflected the passing clouds like rows of patient eyes. The formal gardens spread out to the east, freshly tended, and somewhere in the walled kitchen garden behind the house, a blackbird was singing with the particular intensity of a creature that owns its territory completely and wants the world to know it. The carriage stopped at the front steps. Ruth climbed down first and opened the door, and Cressida stepped out onto the gravel sweep of Oakhaven Manor for the first time in 45 days. She looked different. The change was not dramatic. She wore a well-cut traveling dress of dark blue wool and a simple ivory bonnet, and her face was the same face that had looked out of these windows for 6 years. The difference was in her bearing. There was a steadiness to the way she stood, a quiet ownership in the way her eyes moved across the front of the house that had not been there before. She looked at Oakhaven the way a captain looks at a ship she has just been given command of, with respect for its history, awareness of its needs, and absolute clarity about who was in charge. The household staff were assembled on the front steps in a neat line, as was the custom when the master or mistress of a great house arrived after a long absence. Mrs. Calloway stood at the head of the line, wearing her best black dress and her housekeeper's keys at her belt. Behind her stood Mr. Pennock, the butler, the cook, the footman, the housemaids, the kitchen girls, and the stable boys, every person who kept the machinery of the estate running from dawn to dusk. They stood in silence as Cressida approached, and then Mrs. Calloway did something that none of them had expected, least of all herself. She curtsied deeply, far deeper than a housekeeper was required to curtsy, and said in a clear, steady voice that carried across the courtyard, "Welcome home, my lady." The other servants followed, bowing and curtsying in a ripple that ran down the line like wind through a field of wheat. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. The gesture said everything. The loyalty, the relief, the quiet acknowledgement that the right person had come back to this house. Cressida walked up the front steps and through the main doors into the entrance hall. The hall was half empty now. The Van Dyck portrait was gone, the Georgian silver was gone, the fine Chinese vases that had stood on the marble console tables for as long as anyone could remember had been removed by the bailiffs 3 weeks earlier. The spaces where they had been were marked by faint outlines on the wallpaper and bare patches on the polished wood, like the ghosts of departed objects. She paused in the center of the hall and looked around. Then she removed her bonnet, set it on the one remaining table, and said to Mrs. Calloway, "We will need a complete inventory of what remains, every room, every cupboard, every outbuilding. I want to know exactly what we have to work with." "Yes, my lady, I will begin this afternoon." "And the tenant farms. I want to meet with every tenant family within the week. The rents will need to be reviewed. I suspect some of them have been paying more than they should, and others have repairs that have been waiting too long." Mrs. Calloway nodded, and something in her expression softened. These were the instructions of a woman who intended to manage this estate properly, to care for it, invest in it, and treat the people who depended on it with the attention they deserved. It was, in the housekeeper's long experience, the first time anyone at Oakhaven had spoken about the tenants' needs before their own comfort. Cressida spent the rest of the morning walking through the house, room by room, with Mrs. Calloway at her side and a notebook in her hand. She noted what was missing, what needed repair, and what could be sold or repurposed. She was thorough, practical, and unhurried. When she reached the grand wing, the rooms that had been hers and then briefly Amis's, she opened the curtains, looked out at the lake and the distant hills, and stood there for a long moment in silence. Then she turned to Mrs. Calloway and said, "Move the writing desk back to this room, please, and the wildflowers. I would like wildflowers again." The news of the Chancery ruling had spread through London society with the speed and enthusiasm of a fire in a hay barn. By the 45th day, every drawing room, coffee house, and gentleman's club in the city was humming with the story of the Duke who had lost his estate to his own wife. The details were embellished with each retelling. Some versions had Cressida confronting Peregrine in open court, others had her purchasing his debts at auction like cattle. But the essential truth remained constant and devastating. The Duke of Oakhaven had treated his wife as an ornament, and the ornament had turned out to be the only load-bearing wall in the entire structure. Peregrine himself was living in 2 rented rooms above a tailor's shop in Holborn, surviving on a small quarterly allowance that the Chancery Court had assigned him from the residual income of the estate. The allowance was managed by a firm of bankers who released funds in careful, measured portions, and who required him to submit written requests for any expenditure above £5. It was a system designed to prevent waste and ensure that the debts were repaid from the estate's income over time, and it reduced the former Duke to the financial status of a junior clerk on a modest salary. He had visited his club once since the ruling. He had walked through the front door, crossed the entrance hall, and made it as far as the smoking room before realizing that every conversation in the room had stopped, and every pair of eyes had turned toward him with the particular expression that English society reserves for a man who has fallen publicly and completely. He had turned around and walked out again without sitting down, and he had not been back since. On the 45th day, at approximately the same hour that Cressida was standing at the window of the grand wing looking out at the lake, Peregrine was sitting at the small table in his rented room, staring at a copy of the Morning Chronicle that contained a brief, factual report of the Chancery ruling on its 3rd page. He read it twice, then folded the paper and placed it on the table beside a cold cup of tea. Through the window, he could see the rooftops of London stretching away to the south, and beyond them, somewhere past the smudge of the horizon, the green hills of an estate that still bore his family's name, but no longer answered to it. He sat there for a long time, in a small room above a tailor's shop, listening to the street noise below and the ticking of a cheap mantel clock that did not belong to him, and wondered when exactly the ground had begun to shift beneath his feet, and how he had failed to notice until he was already falling. He would never find the answer. But Cressida had known it all along. The ground had not shifted. It had simply been hers from the very beginning.